Autocracy through history, the forever contest. Do we Americans want a democracy? Or have we reached peak democracy and are slip sliding into a dictatorship? We can shed light on this by looking at the past, and it's not especially good news. In this video, we are going to go back as far as we can, about 12,000 years, and see just how much people have actually lived in democracies. Now, we are only going to look at large-scale societies, what we call polities. We are not going to try to count small groups like villages, tribes, etc. Those are found everywhere back to the beginning of time and around the world. Now, frequently these are non-hierarchical societies. They share resources, they make decisions cooperatively, and they use other what we consider democratic processes. So they can be, and sometimes are, very democratic. We call these village democracies, and they are everywhere. But that doesn't help us. We live in much larger, more complex societies. We are only going to consider larger groups, city-states and above. Also, we need to keep in mind that democracy and autocracy, liberty and despotism are not entirely oppositional. It turns out the contest is not a zero-sum winner-take-all choice. There is a complementary, intertwined, yin and yang, push and pull kind of relationship between the two ideas. And that relationship is built on and reflects genetically based personality traits. So we begin with our DNA. There is very good and increasing evidence that our DNA both creates and affects our personalities. These are built-in traits that affect how we interact in groups and how democratic or autocratic we lean. We have even begun to identify specific genes and gene clusters that are tied to these traits and figure out exactly how they do their job. It's clear as well that we humans are not unique in this. While we like to think our personality is given to us by God, it's indisputable that these traits and the related DNA appear in animals. As an example, we see them in mammals as far apart as dolphins, elephants, and yes, our cousins, the apes and chimpanzees. Because we share very, very ancient common ancestors with all mammals, maybe 9 million years ago for apes and over 65 million years ago for dolphins, it's clear that these genes, these DNA clusters, are deeply embedded. The democracy-autocracy tendency traits can be affected by nurture, culture, religion, schooling, family experience, but they were there 1,000 years ago, and they will be there 1,000 generations in the future. Those traits include both a desire for personal autonomy, along with the desire to belong, a propensity to both dominate and submit, a willingness to cooperate, along with an urge to compete. And there are a number of others. That makes sense. We are group animals, and our personalities evolved individually to help our survival as a group. These traits drive our social behaviors and thus get incorporated in the way human organizations work. So it's safe to say our genetic programming is a critical, though not dispositive, underpinning of all governments. It turns out the group dynamics are also driven to a large degree by Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It doesn't take a genius to see that group physiological and safety needs beat self-actualization needs every time. We also know that survival with constant wars, famines, disease, injuries, etc. has been risky since the first Homo sapiens walked out of his cave. Survival as a lone individual is very hard. Survival as part of a group has a much greater likelihood of success. People with DNA that facilitated group functions tended to survive and pass on their DNA. Loners tended not to reproduce. In group dynamics, that tends to mean the desire for personal liberty tends to be subordinated to the need to belong to and conform to a group. That means groups tend to end up with governments that protect against risk first and self-actualize never. And that has meant generally autocracies. So we start at the beginning, 12,000 years ago, 10,000 years before Christ, in the deep Neolithic and the first large-scale societies we know about. And in the beginning, as hunter-gatherers coalesced into larger groups and began to explore this new thing they called agriculture, we can see a probable scaling up of hunter-gatherer, equitable, non-hierarchical societies. As the millennia tick by, 10,000 BC, 9,000 BC, 8,000 BC, we see some possibly equitable, non-hierarchical Neolithic societies. Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, about 9500 BC, Çatalhöyük, about 600 miles away, starting about 7500 BC, and then the Küçükçekmece culture in modern Ukraine about 5500 BC, about the time of Stonehenge. Nothing in China or Asia, nothing in the Americas. But all of these have disappeared from history, and as far as we can tell, there was no relationship between them and future civilizations. Now the calendar ticks forward to 4000 BC, 6,000 years ago, and everything began to change. Large-scale organized societies, what we call polities, began to appear all over the world. First was the kingdom of Sumer about 4100 BC in southern Mesopotamia. Egypt, with their pharaohs and pyramids, appeared about 3100 BC. The Minoan and Mycenaean civilizations in the eastern Mediterranean, both with kings, also appeared about 3000 BC. The Indus Valley civilization in India, again with an elite hierarchy, appeared about 3300 BC, and possibly a mythical Emperor Fuji in China about 2900 BC. In the Americas, there was the Carol Supe Society in Peru, again with elite rulers, also about 3000 BC. New city-states, kingdoms, and empires rose, flourished, and were replaced with other kingdoms on a regular basis. But they were all autocracy. There wasn't a democracy among them. Of very few examples. In Mesopotamia, there was the very first empire, the Akkadian Empire, with Sargon the Great about 2300 BC, the Assyrian Empire about 2025 BC, and the Babylonian Empire with Hammurabi in 1894 BC. In China, the Shang dynasty arose about 1600 BC. And around the world, in the Americas, there were the Mayans, maybe as early as 1500 BC, and the Olmecs about 1200 BC. As an aside, ancient Israel was never a democracy. From the Old Testament, when Israel first fled Egypt, they wandered in the desert for 40 years as a theocracy ruled by Moses. They were not a republic. When they finally invaded Canaan, they were a confederation of tribes led by Joshua, a charismatic war chieftain appointed by Moses. And for the next 400 years, the tribes, each with their own area, were led by hereditary tribal chieftains, or charismatic war leaders they called judges. In about 1000 BC, give or take, they transformed, with the Lord's approval, into a monarchy, and the rest is history. However a polity started, by the time we see it in the record, is an autocracy. There were lots of wars, invasions, and rebellions. None of those ended in a democratic state. It was autocracies all the way down. That brings us to 500 BC. And something quite new appeared. Around the Mediterranean, in Greece and Rome, two monarchic societies 800 miles apart, democracy, without any real build-up beforehand, suddenly took the stage. We don't know really why or how these two cultures, separated by hundreds of miles, essentially simultaneously established and maintained, truly, for their time, democracies. However it started, this had never happened before in world history. It would not happen again for 2,000 years. Now there were commonalities. Greece had planted colonies in Italy and around the Mediterranean for a couple of centuries before 500 BC. People, trade, and ideas had passed between Greece and Rome long before 500 BC. We know they had largely the same religions, and we know that Rome knew and admired Greek tradition, philosophy, and culture. Now, Greece really consisted of perhaps 1,000 Greek city-states and colonies around the Mediterranean. These tiny states oscillated between oligarchies, tyrannies, vassalage, and sometimes direct democracies. But first among them was Athens, and Athens, under Cleisthenes, replaced its king with a direct democracy in 510 BC. Except for a brief 8-month tyranny in 403 BC, Athens' democracy lasted almost 200 years, until 322 BC, when Alexander the Great conquered it and made it a part of his empire. In 509 BC, about the same time, 800 miles away from Greece, according to Roman tradition, Rome overthrew their Etruscan king and declared themselves a republic, which is a form of a representative democracy. The Romans, who knew how to build things that lasted, set up a republic with regular elections, elected executives, popular voting, the rule of law, a senate and elected lower houses, and for the most part, peaceful transfers of power. That republic proved to be both durable and adaptable. It lasted 500 years, until torn by civil war, it became the Roman Empire under Caesar Augustus in 26 AD. But both democracies proved to be outliers. They led to nothing. Athens had a democracy only in Athens, and for at most 60,000 voters. Rome's republican government was only in Europe and the Mediterranean basin. Everywhere else in the world, the Americas, Asia, China, Africa, Northern Europe, stayed autocracies. When Athens and then Rome fell, democracy essentially disappeared. For the next almost 1800 years, the world was all or almost all autocratic, whether it was the Franks and Gauls in Europe, the Muslims coming out of Arabia, the rise of native kingdoms in Africa and America, or the Song and Lao dynasties in China. It was nobles, kings, caliphs, and emperors all the way down. There were a very few micro-republics, but none of them lasted. In the Middle Ages, several European city-states called themselves republics and had off and on relatively democratic governments. But eventually all of these micro-city-states failed and morphed into some form of autocracy or were absorbed into larger kingdoms. In the Americas, Tlaxcala, a small indigenous neighbor of the Aztecs, had been an independent democracy for about 100 years when Cortez showed up. After they joined with Cortez to conquer the Aztecs, they were made slaves and absorbed into the Spanish Empire under Cortez and the Spanish king. If an alien was watching Earth, it would be obvious we were right back where we started in 4000 BC, with an unending string of autocrats. But in fact, something both old and new was brewing. Starting about the 13th century, a confluence of things happened, all in Western Europe. The feudal system with many competing microstates, the Renaissance, the discovery of the Americas, the secular revolution, the Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the growth of science and secularization. Slowly at first, then quickly, this nurtured the meaningful growth of ideas, like personal and religious liberty and political self-government. The result was the stable, viable growth of democracy. Some of this was the gradual replacement of autocratic ideals with democratic ideals. Some was actual change in governments. This did not have to happen. It had never happened before. It might not have happened at all had the culture in Western Europe been just a little bit different. Those ideas eroded the ideological grip of autocracy over the centuries, but did not result in much actual change in governments until the American Revolution in 1776. That was another sudden phase change. The world was never the same. And after 1800, the growth in democracies as actual governments accelerated. But it was a torturous process. The initial ideals of the French Revolution in 1792 ended in the terror and the birth of the Napoleonic Empire. South American revolutions ended Spanish and Portuguese rule, but frequently those new democracies deteriorated into oligarchies or outright dictatorships. European nations began to become freer at home, but also build huge world-spanning autocratic empires. Nationalist freedom movements seemed to morph inevitably into dictatorships. By the end of the 19th century, democracy was well on its way to becoming a major player on the world stage. Come the 20th century, and we saw the best and worst of governments. The catastrophe of World War I shattered many of the great European empires and resulted in the birth of new democracies. For a brief moment, it looked like democracy was on the way to winning. But autocracy evolved and was revitalized in new forms. The Russian Revolution in 1917 quickly became one of the world's worst dictatorships. Islam, seen prior to World War I as a leftover religion from medieval times, resurged and re-emerged as a violent, authoritarian religious force. The result was some of the worst dictatorships in world history: the communist dictatorship in Russia, the USSR and the Eastern Bloc, the devastating rise and fall of fascism, Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan, the resulting devastation of World War II, and then the communist Eastern Bloc, the Cold War, and communist China. But despite the great 20th century convulsions, by the end of the century it looked like democracy was winning. Authoritarianism in the form of kingdoms, empires, and communist regimes was largely exhausted. The UN was an effective, semi-democratic world body. Communist Russia had collapsed. Communist China was moderating. Communism as an ideal seemed dead. The United States, a bastion of democracy and human rights, was the undisputed world superpower, and the world was approximately 50% democracies. But autocracy and authoritarianism, which are never going away, have always been both individually and politically attractive models. It turned out that many people simply did not want or like democracy. Revitalized forms of nationalist, ethnic, and religious autocracies reappeared, and people liked them. The initial question was, is democracy winning? And the answer, sadly, is probably not. Instead, the chances are high democracy has reached, at least for now, either equilibrium with authoritarianism, and we are likely to spend the rest of our lives going back and forth between authoritarian states and democratic states, or it is equally possible that democracy has reached too far and the pendulum is beginning to swing back.